either seek to co-opt the artist actor or will set itself in opposition to the artist actor. Okay, so that should be clear. Top of page 7 then. Now we're going to look, 70. Now we're going to look specifically at what Nietzsche does. 390. Okay, so with all of that said, I think we can make sense now of Nietzsche's specific attack against the church. All right, now we have the foundation laid solidly in order to discuss his specific critique with the church. So we have the artist, right? And the artist creates the work of art, right? So that art becomes the consequence of the artist's work, okay? But that work is in opposition to dogma. Dogma as the prevailing social narrative. That social narrative, within the context of Nietzsche, is informed by the church. And I should put moral dogma, right? So that with respect to morality, the artist's interpretation is in opposition to the dogma that's informed by the church. The church says, with respect to morality, here's the way in, and you know what's funny about this, quick side note, is that this applies directly to the current situation in the United States presidential election, at least in 2012, right? Currently in 2012, surprisingly, a lot of the social narrative within the United States, rather than being about economic concerns, which I think is more important, is about social concerns. It's about religious concerns, about the ability for women to use contraception and the rights of homosexuals to marry and just things that you at this point in American history would take for granted. I can't believe that, you know, in the 21st century, in 2012, we're still talking about whether or not women should have the right to use contraception, right? The debate, this public conflict arises because part of the society, part of American demography, ascribes to, I wouldn't say an artistic representation, but an alternative to the traditional sort of liturgical dogma, right? This is, as Nietzsche says, the sacerdotal class, the class of priests determine what moral action is, and the response to that is to rail against that via our social media, our social influences, our artists. Again, as I said in the last section, Bill Maher's critique is an artistic critique of the dogma. Right? Bill Maher is a perfect example. I mean, and Bill Maher literally embodies this. Shout out to Bill Maher. Right? Bill Maher, as an individual, literally embodies this. Right? He is an artist. He's a comedic personality, and he's also a pretty good sort of political pundit. I don't think he'd like that phrase, but he understands politics and he interprets the political discourse in a comedic way. He also does this in opposition to the church. I mean, he's like the biggest rail against Jesus, Christianity comedian since probably Carlin, right? So the artist rails against, right, is in opposition, the discourse that the artist creates is in opposition to the traditional sort of dogmatic discourse that's given from the church, that's informed by the church. And then individuals within society have an ability to choose which path they'll take, right? Either I will assume the path and accept the path of the artist, right? And you can see now the internal is made external for consumption, the individual can choose, or I'll assume the path that's given, informed by the church. And, you know, this is where we are. So here's a quote from Nietzsche to sort of, don't take my word for it. Religious morality, affect, great desire, the passion for power, love, revenge, possessions. Morality wants to extinguish and uproot them, the passions. Morality is there to suppress them, to purify the soul of them. Now, just as an aside, it's not arbitrary that I've placed the artist on the left side and the church on the right side. Just a little inside joke, right? A more liberal interpretation of our social structure, a more conservative interpretation of our social structure, a more leftist approach, a more rightist approach, a centrist approach. You can see how this would overlap, right? So I didn't do this arbitrarily. I designed this specifically to sort of loosely convey that idea, but I'm not going to explain that more than what's there. Okay, so I want to read one bit. Now, the section that I read, 383. All right, so I want to read 383 and 385. I'm going to sort of infuse both of these sections. The very last paragraph in note 383, Nietzsche says the following. Instead of, and this is important, right? Instead of taking into service the great sources of strength, those impetuous torrents of the soul that are so often dangerous and overwhelming, instead of incorporating into the soul, whatever that is, Nietzsche would say, those dangerous, impetuous, sort of torrential elements, and economizing them, making use of them, this most short-sighted and pernicious mode of thought, the moral mode of thought, wants to make them dry up, right? So instead of capitalizing, right, here is the individual, instead of capitalizing on, I don't know, say evil, I don't know, darkness, I'll just put emo, right? Instead of being emo, right? Instead of being emo and incorporating that sort of darker side into the individual, the church wants you to suppress that, right? The church wants to suppress this. And I have to remember to plug this thing out. Church is there to deny, suppress. Right? The church is there to deny, suppress that. They don't want you to incorporate the darker things, the darker elements, the bad guy narrative, right? They don't want you to empathize with things that are vile, things that are base, right? Only happy, smiley, shiny, happy people holding hands, right? Plastic. Instead of incorporating this and economizing it, they want to suppress, they want to deny, they want to block you off from that. But think about this, right? If an individual learns how to economize these elements, these darker elements, into his or her work, those darker elements are part of reality, right? Those darker elements inform the artist. This is to no surprise that an overwhelming majority of our artistic community, they're emo, right? Not all of them, right? But you know, you might drink too much, you might smoke too much, you might participate in drug use, you're an emotional wreck, right? Perfect example. Adele releases an epic year of music, just phenomenal music. She puts this music out, and it's a consequence of all the pain that either she envisioned or she actually experienced, and you can feel that pain, right? Oh, you know, you're about to get married or whatever, and you know, you should have chose me and not her. I mean, geez, your heart just breaks for the girl, right? That Adele has realized and recognized a means of economizing that anguish, that pain, that darkness, directing that inward, economizing it, and then creating something in the world which challenges the overarching structure. No, see, I can show you that you can economize, that you can incorporate a lot of this darkness, a lot of this emotional angst into yourself as an individual, and use it to create something profound. There's no surprise, if you go through my Facebook profile pics, my profile pics are 90% of them all dark, all bad guys, all pain, all anguish. Why? It's a recognition to me that, and I'm a genocide theorist, and I do conflict resolution. For me, it's a recognition that I daily sit at the table, theoretically, sit at the table and sort of ingest all of this sort of emotional turmoil, all of this recklessness, all of the most base aspects of our human character, not to dispose of it, but to have an appreciation for what it is that we're capable of doing. Right? I don't worship it, I don't want to emulate it, but I need to have an understanding of it to transform that thing then, to economize it and make it something new, make it something good, make it something productive.